Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am so happy to be back with you for a second episode this week, a second author interview. If you haven't listened to Tuesday's episode with returning guest Tracy Clark, then you might want to do that at some point, especially if you're a fan of crime fiction. And I hope you're looking forward to this episode. As I mentioned at the end of last episode, I am talking to Elizabeth Shick about her debut novel, The Golden Land. Before we talk about the book, though, how is your week going? Do you have fun weekend plans? Hopefully you've got something going on this weekend that you are looking forward to. Yesterday was my and my husband's wedding anniversary. Actually, we got married on the second anniversary of our first date, so we count both anniversaries. So yesterday was our 13th and 11th anniversary. 13th anniversary of our first date, 11th wedding anniversary. And he was giving me a hard time because I had a doctor's appointment scheduled for Monday, and the doctor had an emergency with her daughter that she needed to take care of, and so they asked if I could reschedule. Of course, no problem. They said, "How's Thursday?" I said, "Yep, that looks good." Looked at my calendar, and then I got home and my husband and I share a calendar, so he said, "Why did you schedule a doctor's appointment on our anniversary when I have the whole day blocked off?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I knew that was coming up. I just looked and saw Thursday, not the date." But then it turns out that he had some kind of a stomach bug, and so he spent about 12 hours yesterday just, poor man, throwing up, and it was awful. I felt so bad for him. Last year we were in Paris for our anniversary, which is great, except that he had a kidney stone. So I've decided that next year I am wrapping him in bubble wrap, our anniversary. I don't know, we got to figure that out. If he hadn't started feeling better last night, I was seriously thinking about taking him to the emergency room, which is where we spent last anniversary, or the day after last anniversary when we got back from Paris. I don't need that to be the new tradition. But he's feeling better today. He's, of course, very, very tired and sore and dehydrated, and for some reason I seem to have sympathy dehydration, even though I drink a ton of water. Maybe that's just mental. But let's change direction and talk about books. As I mentioned, today's author is Elizabeth Shick. We are talking about her debut novel. It is called The Golden Land. Let me give you a description of the book. When Edda's grandmother dies, she is compelled to travel to Myanmar to explore complicated adolescent memories of her grandmother's family and the violence she witnessed there. Full of rich detail and complex relationships, The Golden Land explores those personal narratives that might lie beneath the surface of historical accounts. And that is the description. It's not terribly long, it's to the point, but that is really what that is about. And actually, it made me realize, because I'm reading this to you and looking at the cover as I read you the description, because I've been reading digital copies of books since we moved. I don't often see the covers as much as I would if I had the physical copy in my hand, and this cover is perfect because it's got a lot of gold and orange, and it goes with the title, The Golden Land. But then that last sentence, those personal narratives that might lie beneath the surface of historical accounts. And there's two hands coming up out of, could be water, could be mist, but it's a very evocative, very, very compelling cover that I am just now kind of paying attention to, since I hadn't looked at it much before. But this story is, as it says, about Edda, but it's also about generations. Her grandmother married an American soldier during World War II, moved to Boston. It's a multi-generational household. Edda, her sister, their parents, and her grandmother live together. Her grandmother is a force. The book takes place between 1988 and 2011. In 1988, they went back to Burma. It became Myanmar, I think, in 1989, so a year after their trip. They went back for the first time for her grandmother, for the first time for any of them except the grandmother, who went back for the first time in 40 years. And it is about families of origin. It is about navigating culture. It's about trying to figure out relationships. And it's one of those books where sometimes as a reader, you're like, oh my gosh, if you would just communicate about this, why didn't you just talk about it? With all of these relationships and these complicated scenarios that are going on. But of course, if I'm being completely honest, I don't always communicate well in my own life, right? It's so much easier to yell at a fictional character in the book that you're reading, just talk about it. But it's so well written and put together, and you get these stories of generations and how violence and trauma can change relationships and change perceptions and change so many different things, because that 1988 trip is such a turning point for Etta and her character and her life and her relationships. But let's go ahead and have Elizabeth tell you more about the book and the writing of the book. Again, it is called The Golden Land, and the author is Elizabeth Shick. Let's turn now to that interview. Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you to talk about your book, The Golden Land. Before we talk about the book, though, if you wouldn't mind just taking a couple minutes to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that'd be great.
Sure. So much like yourself, I am an American expat. I've lived abroad in various parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe for almost 30 years now. So I grew up outside of Boston, in what was at the time a very homogeneous suburb, very white. So when I got to college, I started taking a lot of classes to learn about other parts of the world and other cultures, which really fascinated me. I ended up spending an entire year in Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam. And after college, I went back to get my master's in international affairs and began to pursue a career in international development, mainly because I wanted to get back to Africa because I loved it so much. So along the way, I met my husband, who was also working in international development, and we had 2 daughters. So we continued to move around the world. But after my kids were born, I wanted to spend more time at home with them. So I began to cut down on my work in international development. And that's when I began dabbling in writing, which was something I could do from home, of course. So my first published novel is The Golden Land. And that was inspired by 6 years that my family and I were fortunate to live in Myanmar in Southeast Asia.
Yes, and as I was reading your biography at the end of the book and you listed all the many places that you've lived, I was equal parts a little bit envious because it sounds amazing, and also in awe because I've only done one visa process and one residency process, and I was like, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, well, like anything, it has its pros and cons for sure.
Yes.
For sure.
Just the sheer amount of paperwork for a whole family must have been an adventure.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. My husband is actually Italian Australian, so he has Italian nationality, and my daughter, and so do my daughters. Well, they have both American and Italian, so that and Australian actually. So that made it easier in some places. Yeah, not in all places, but in some places.
Fun. Well, again, as you mentioned, the book is called The Golden Land. Can you give an overview of that story?
Yeah, I'd love to. So The Golden Land is a novel really about coming to terms with the past, about reconciling family history and national political history with personal experiences. As the novel opens, Etta, who is the narrator, and her little sister Parker, they're 2 American sisters living in Boston, and they are grieving the death of their Burmese grandmother, who essentially raised them. Etta in particular had a very complicated relationship with her grandmother. So as she begins to sort through her grandmother's belongings, she's confronted by a flood of childhood memories, many of which revolve around a 1988 family reunion in what was then called Burma, but is now called Myanmar. And Etta was 13 at the time. Her sister Parker was 6. Some of these memories are very happy memories. They revolve around a boy named Shui, who Etta was quite taken with. Being 13, it's a time of very intense teenage infatuation. So those are happy memories, but other memories are much more traumatic, stemming from some violence that she and Shui together witnessed while they were there. So meanwhile, as Etta is sorting through, grappling with all these memories, her little sister Parker makes an impulsive decision, which Etta doesn't agree with, to take the grandmother's ashes back to Myanmar. So it's 2011 at this time. Etta is basically left with the decision of whether to stay back in Boston with her fiancé Jason, who loves her very much, and her promising career in labor law, or return to, the site of this violence that she witnessed and confront her memories by returning to Myanmar. So the novel is written in alternating chapters of 1988 and 2011, and it also goes back and forth between Boston and Burma/Myanmar, depending on the time, because the name changed in 1989. So goes back and forth between those two time periods and places.
Okay, so now that you know a little bit more about Elizabeth and the book itself, let's go ahead and take our first break for this episode. When we come back, Elizabeth will be talking about the inspiration for this book. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Elizabeth Shick. We are talking about her debut novel, The Golden Land. Let's return to that interview. Your inspiration for the story, was that partly because you had lived there for several years, or did you have a different jumping off point for the story?
No, it was definitely because I had lived there. It was inspired by those 6 years that my family and I lived there, which was 2013 to 2019. I had never lived in Asia before, so I was really fascinated to learn, about a new culture, and I knew nothing about Myanmar, absolutely nothing. So I didn't set out to write a novel. I didn't, think that was, it just didn't occur to me at all, although I had written a novel previously, which is not published yet. I just wanted to get to know the country. So I was trying to learn about the history and the culture, which is something I always do just out of curiosity and also respect for my host country. I just want to learn as much as I can. So I took language lessons. I joined a local book club. I read a ton of books, and mostly just asked a lot of questions of all the people I met. Myanmar had just come out of 50 years of military dictatorship. So it was a really fascinating time to be living there. The country was opening up to the world for the first time in 50 years, and people were beginning to invest in their future in a way that hadn't been possible before, and also talk about their experiences. So, it was perfect for me because I like to ask a lot of questions, and they were ready to start talking about the past, which there had been so much censorship before that they weren't allowed to talk about politics or history or anything. So it was in this context that I began to wonder what it must have been like like on a day-to-day basis to live under a military dictatorship. You know, what sacrifices people had to make in order to just cope, you know, with life. When sometimes like their neighbors or, you know, their fishmonger or even somebody in their family might actually be connected to the military. So that was one of the things that inspired me to write The Golden Land, because I didn't have the answer to that question. And I write when I kind of have questions, but no answers. And then another thing that really fascinated me was that there were many former Burmese nationals who had been living in exile, sometimes for decades, who were returning to the country because it was opening up. And as somebody who lives abroad, you know, even though I can obviously return anytime I want, I was just really interested in what that must feel like for them, you know, to be separated from the setting of their childhood memories, and then to return, you know, maybe 30 years later to those formative childhood memories, the place where they took place. So these were some of the themes basically that were just, I would say, like percolating in my head. And when I sat down to write, you know, they just sort of came out and began to bubble over.
Sure. Yeah. And the timing of when you lived there was really interesting and great for asking those questions. When it comes to the history, the recent history, but also even some of the former history that you mentioned, because you talk about the last king and queen a little bit as part of Etta's childhood lore. I realized I know about 0.5% of Burmese history. You know, there's some things that you remember from the news during various points, but how hard was it to try to take that and boil it down into a cohesive story that made sense of the setting?
That's a good question. Yeah, you know so as I said, like the story kind of grew out like of organic research that I was doing. Like I didn't intend to write a novel. So I was just following my curiosity, like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to know more about that. You know, I want to know more about that. And so when I sat down to write, you know, it was kind of a mess. You know, it was like all of these different things wanted to come out onto the page. And it took a lot of organizing later. I mean, I just let it flow at first, but there was a certain point where I had to go back and organize it, you know, to put it in order, which was a long process. It was pretty challenging. Basically, I was writing in the present narrative, but I had a lot of flashbacks. So I had flashbacks going back to 1988, which are still there in the book, but in a different form. And I also had other flashbacks to like 1944, 45, which was when the grandmother met her American husband, who was a soldier in the war, based in Burma. And I also had flashbacks, I guess, to the last king and queen of Burma, which was the late 1800s. So, then at that point, I shared an early draft with some readers, and they said that the flashbacks were kind of stealing the limelight from the present narrative. So I ended up having to really like do some soul searching and figure out, you know, how to reorganize that. And, you know, I remember one mentor that I was working with, a writing mentor, and he said, well, you know, which is more important? And they were equally important, right? So that's when I rearranged the entire novel into alternating chapters so that it was two narratives rather than one narrative with flashbacks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it makes sense when I think about that earlier draft and trying to put in some of those other flashbacks. While they might be interesting, it would be easy to get bogged down in too much detail.
Yeah, exactly. And for the reader to get lost, you know, because like they don't know what to focus on. So,
right. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Etta as the main character. What do you think about her is going to resonate most with readers?
Well, I think there's a lot about Etta that might resonate with readers. I mean, she's a woman who's trying to make sense of her life. You know, she's trying to find her place in the world, but just unable to move forward because she's afraid of the past. She's afraid to face, or maybe unable to face, some unresolved, buried memories from the past. And this is really holding her back. So she's a woman who is stuck, I would say, emotionally stuck, unable to join together two disparate parts of her life, which I think many readers will identify with, because regardless of your background, whether or not you have, you know, two cultures in your background, like, we all have different parts of our life that don't necessarily, you know, mesh together, and that sometimes holds us back.
Yeah, in some ways, she really is stuck at that 13-year-old girl because so much of her life changed from that trip with her family. You know, she's moved on in some ways, but you really start to see it as she starts interacting with people who have moved on in different ways, and she's still stuck in certain feelings or emotions from that time.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of people are trying to help her. You know, a lot of people who care about her, the other characters, they're all trying to help her to move on. But, you know, she really has to like do this herself and face the past.
Mm-hmm. Was it, how was it writing Etta? She is a quarter Burmese. She is very American, but she also has this very domineering grandmother who instilled a lot of culture in her and language. How was it just kind of trying to bring all those pieces of her character into the writing of Etta?
She was a difficult character to crack, actually, because she's so stuck emotionally, you know, it was hard to access her emotions in a way. And that's where I found the other characters really helped me, because they, you know, since they were all trying to help her in a way, like that gave me an access to her, and I could, from their perspective, sort of like look at what she was going through. And in terms of being a quarter Burmese, you know, like, obviously I'm not a quarter, well, nobody can see me, but I'm not a quarter Burmese. I'm not Burmese at all. But I felt that she had to be at least part Burmese in order for this story to work. So it was very, very important for me to get that right and not to, you know, fall into any tropes or stereotypes. So I did spend a lot of time working on that. And I was lucky to have Burmese friends that I could ask questions of and share drafts with and get their feedback. So they really helped me a lot.
Yeah. And then I was also, this is just a small part, but it brings in some important aspects into the story. Can you talk a little bit about the marionettes, and maybe not necessarily even how they affect the story, but just why you brought them in and their significance in Burmese culture?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a perfect example of where I didn't, you know, set out to write a novel that had marionettes in it, but I went to a show, you know, I went to a local marionette show. And there's actually a link to that, marionette company on my website, if anybody's interested, where you can watch videos. I mean, they're just fascinating. And this, group, it's called the Tue U Puppet Theater or something like that. And they, you know, they're really dedicated to trying to resurrect the marionettes, and because they were really important in the past in Burmese culture. Like, they were actually the only ones who could dare say something controversial to the king and queen. You know, people couldn't, you know, even way back then, which was before military dictatorship and everything. You know, you weren't allowed to like say anything that the king didn't like, but the marionettes could, you know, so they really had a very important role in society. And, the Burmese name for them actually means little people. So, I was, you know, this company that I went to see the show at, you know, they explained all this, and I just became really, really intrigued. So when I sat down to write, you know, the marionettes just appeared, like they just showed up in a trunk, right? Or in a box in the closet. But they were, you know, the thing that's interesting about that, and this is where I think like the subconscious is so amazing the way it works when you're writing is that, so Etta finds these marionettes, and they're broken. And that is what leads her to meet this other character, Usotet, who is like my favorite character in the book. And, if I hadn't put the marionettes in there, probably I wouldn't have found that character, So I feel like that was kind of meant to be, that the marionettes led me to Usotet, who was really, he's a small character, but he's pretty key in many ways.
He is. And actually, I could use more of his story. But, you can't have everything in a book. And I'm excited to hear that there's a link on your website, because I love to look things up as I'm reading, like looking up names that you mentioned. I looked up the king and queen. I looked up the giant Buddha statue, the things like that. So I have a better
Great. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. So then I want to watch the marionettes, the actual show. That will be fascinating, I think. It is time for our second break of this episode. I will say that I did go to Elizabeth's website and click on that link to watch the marionette shows, because I'm fascinated by that and the history and the culture and just the skill that it takes to create poetry like that. But unfortunately, my computer was being very persnickety at that moment, and so I have not yet gotten to watch, but it's still on my list. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, Elizabeth will be talking more about character development. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today, of course, with author Elizabeth Shick about her debut novel, The Golden Land. Let's return to that conversation. In terms of character development, when you sit down to write, do you have a pretty good understanding of the characters before you start writing, or do you like to let them evolve as you write, or is it a combination?
I have no understanding of the characters often, or the story often, for a very long time. I sit down to write, and it comes out, and, I just go with that for a while. But what invariably will happen about midway through, after I've written 100 pages, or I don't know exactly how many, but at a certain point, I will just put my head in my hands, and I'll be like, what have I done? And I'm completely overwhelmed. And that's when I'll stop, and I will go back and read it and put, actually maybe make an outline of what I've written so far and where I want to go with it. And also do some kind of light character sketches, but I don't start off with it. I don't think I could do that because, I don't know, it just feels too contrived to me. I like it when they develop organically, but then I do need to definitely stop and organize. So that's, it's not a process I would recommend because it's very, very messy and probably very inefficient, but it's what works for me somehow.
Well, and this isn't characters, but if you hadn't left that open, then the marionettes would not have appeared in a box in a closet.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I am fascinated with well, I'm fascinated with a lot of aspects about family, but genetics especially. And so Parker and Etta, sisters, but they look very different. One is blonde haired, blue eyed. One is dark haired, dark eyes. And I actually have a friend who is, her children are a quarter Chinese, and same thing. One is blonde hair, blue eyed. One is dark hair, dark eye. And it's always fascinating to see how genetics play out. But did you start out with them looking that differently, or did that also evolve?
I did actually start out with them looking differently, because I had a friend in college that was the same, not Myanmar, but also like a quarter something. And she and her sister looked very, very different. And that was also very fascinating to me, how that could be, how that could happen. And I think also another thing I'm interested in, and it plays out in The Golden Land, is how two siblings from the same family actually experience the family differently because of when they were born. So in Etta and Parker's case, they're 7 years apart. So they have like a completely different set of memories. So they have their different genetics and how they look, but also a different set of memories depending on what was happening in their family. And actually back in Myanmar, as they were growing up, and their level of understanding because of their age.
Yeah, absolutely. My sister and I are also 6.5 years apart, and we don't have the dramatic events of Etta and Parker's life, but sometimes I think, did we grow up in the same family?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, were there any particular challenges to writing the book or the story?
The biggest challenge, I would say, well, there were two. One that, as I said, it was very important to me to get it right in terms of writing about another culture. I just I was writing out of respect. I have a lot of respect for Myanmar people and care a lot about the country, so that, I think that did help me. But it was a challenge. I was kind of terrified the entire time. But I did put a lot into that. And then the other one I sort of touched on already, but is the timeline. That dual timeline was pretty challenging because, as I said, it was one narrative with a whole lot of flashbacks. It was really, really messy. And I didn't know how to fix it at first. So I actually read some other novels is what I did. So I read different novels that have different time periods. And, sometimes some of them are like part one, part two, in a different, part one is in one time period, part two is in another. And some of them just do the flashback model. And sometimes they have the alternating, and I had to really think about what made sense for this novel. So I didn't think the part one, part two could work because, we are learning about what happened in Etta's childhood as she is sort of remembering it. So I did want it to be at the same time. So that's how I landed on that. But it was a lot of reorganization, a lot of work, because when I took all those flashbacks out, I had to put them back in. They weren't even in order, in chronological order. So I had to put them in order. And then of course I found holes and mistakes sometimes in, what would work in the timing. And I also wanted to make sure that fit with the real historical events. So I actually had an Excel spreadsheet with the real historical events and then their life when they were born, when each character was born and what happened, the major milestones in their life. So that was a lot of work. But I enjoyed it. So it was fun.
Well, anyone who sets up a Excel spreadsheet to keep things organized is near and dear to my heart. I love making lists.
Yes. Yeah.
Since you wrote this as kind of a tribute to the country that you lived in and your experience there and the people, what do you hope readers might take away from the book?
So that's a really interesting question because it's changed over time. So when I was first writing, I think I just wanted to share some of the magic of Myanmar, help readers to get to know this really fascinating but largely unknown culture that I was so fortunate to experience during the 6 years I lived there. And at the same time, there's not a lot of fiction written in English about Myanmar. And there are a few really great ones, and they're also listed on my website, but there aren't a lot compared to a lot of other countries. And so I also hoped that, the Golden Land might inspire people from Myanmar or with connections to Myanmar to share their own stories. So that was my initial thinking, as far as I remember. But this all changed in February of 2021, when, after a decade of peace and democratization, unfortunately, the country was plunged back into, total darkness by another military coup d'etat, creating a situation which is much like ETA experienced in 1988. And this is something I never dreamed would happen. I thought I was writing about the past, something that was like not going to happen again, because I was living there during this wonderful time of peace and development. But since February 2021, the country is back like it was back like 1988, and that's still the case today. So my hope today is that the Golden Land will help draw attention to the situation in Myanmar. And again, on my website, I have like a whole section there with different organizations, mostly local organizations that you can donate to if you're interested in helping the pro-democracy movement. And I've also been partnering with a wonderful organization called Boston Free Burma, which I happened upon by mistake, just because my husband and I were in Boston one day and we decided to go to the only Burmese restaurant, probably in New England, which features in the book. It's called Yoma Burmese Restaurant in Allston, Massachusetts. And so, this restaurant, when we went there, it was very, very emotional for all of us, because we were like, we lived in Myanmar, and, we were all crying because of what's happening there today. And then we asked them, is there anything that we can, way we can get involved? And they said, well, actually, we have this group and we do fundraisers. So I've done a couple of fundraisers with them where I donate the proceeds of the book to their organization, and then they donate it to pro-democracy, the pro-democracy movement back in Myanmar. So that's my hope today, is to help Myanmar to get back to the way it was, because it's really tragic what's happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to minimize that experience, but you mentioned the restaurant, which then brought you to this wonderful fundraising that you're able to do. But food also plays a big part in the book. And so I'm curious, some of your favorite food from your time living in Myanmar.
Oh, there was, the food is amazing. Again, I didn't know anything about the culture before moving there, so I was really just amazed by the cuisine. Myanmar is surrounded by Thailand, China, and India. So if you could think of those three cuisines, and Bangladesh, and there's a small border with Laos as well. So, it's like a wonderful combination of all of those. They have these salads that they like to prepare, and they're just really delicious. Like, they all have, it could be a tomato salad, it could be like an eggplant salad. They actually have a green tea leaf salad. And then they all have all these different, flavorings. Like, they'll have, crumbled up peanuts and crunchy fried onions and coriander, or, I don't know, just all kinds of different things. And they're delicious. And I don't know if I mentioned actually the book club. I belonged to a book club while I was there, a local book club of mostly Myanmar women. And the woman who started the book club, who invited me into it, is a wonderful, wonderful cook. So we would often have our meetings at her house, and she would just cook all this food for us. And I just felt so lucky to be part of that. It's really delicious food. I highly recommend go find a Burmese restaurant in your community and try it out.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen one in Portugal, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But those salads sounded amazing when you were describing them in the book. So
yeah.
Yeah, okay, now I am hungry again after that conversation about the amazing sounding food. Let's go ahead and take our last break of this episode. When we come, we'll be talking about any current projects that Elizabeth has going on. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Elizabeth Shick. How about now? Are you working on a new project?
I'm working on a few things at once. So I mentioned before, I have a previous novel that I wrote before The Golden Land. It's set in Malawi in southeastern Africa, where we also lived for a period of time. And so I'm trying to just sort of revise that, polish that up, and maybe start querying to find a publisher for that novel. So that's one thing I'm working on. And then I also have an idea, which is in its very early stages, for a novel about an American woman living in Bangladesh, which is where I live now. So that's in its very early stages. I don't know what's going to happen with it, but I like the idea. So I'm just starting to work on that. And I've been working for many years on some personal essays, which may or may not make their way into a memoir one day. We'll see.
Makes sense. And you talked a little bit about why and when you started writing. What was that final impetus that's made you think, you know what, I'm going to try to get something published?
I did start writing late in life. So I was not, I sometimes meet people who say they've been writing since they were 5. And, I actually loved reading always. And I was a dreamer for sure, but I didn't think that I could write fiction because, I think partially because I didn't know any writers. I had never really met a writer before until, really, until I became a writer. So I sort of thought that fiction was something that you needed to have some magical powers that I couldn't possibly have, to do. But what started me writing was that one day a friend of mine, I was living in Italy at the time, and she told me about an online writing course that she was taking. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. As I mentioned, I was sort of cutting back on my work, to be with my kids, but I also wanted to have something for myself, so I thought, maybe I'll take a writing course. But even at that point, I didn't think I could write fiction. So I took a memoir writing course. And it was in this course that I learned that actually fiction and memoir use a lot of the same techniques. So, you need to learn about characters and dialogue and pacing and all that stuff. They're actually very similar. And so that was what led me to try my hand at fiction, when I realized that I could just apply these same techniques. In terms of publishing, I was pretty shy about trying to get published. So, as I said, I have this whole other novel, sitting in a drawer, which I really didn't try to publish before. And then I wrote The Golden Land, and I really felt like it was a story that I wanted to get out there. I also, while I was writing the Golden Land, I enrolled in a low residency MFA program. And part of why I did that was to force myself to take myself seriously as a writer, to take writing seriously. So, with having gone through that program, and worked on The Golden Land in that program, I decided that I did want to try to publish it. But I didn't go the normal route for publishing. I applied to contests. So there were several that I applied to, but I ended up winning the first one I applied to, which was the AWP prize for the novel. The AWP is the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, and that prize came with a publishing contract. So that's what got me started.
Wow. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was very exciting. Thank you.
For someone who is maybe thinking they want to try writing, but lots of things are holding them back, do you have any particular advice from your own experience?
Yeah, my advice for anyone who wants to start writing is to make friends with other writers. I think even if you're not ready to share your writing, just talking about the writing process with somebody who understands what that means is just so beneficial. Because writing is hard and it can also be very lonely. And I made the mistake of writing in isolation for many years, and that was very discouraging. You know, it was hard to keep motivated when I was just on my own doing it. And I stopped a lot. You know, there would be months at a time where I wouldn't write. But once I started spending time with other writers, and it did take, you know, a little bit for me to be brave enough to do that. You know, I was so shy about it. I realized that when you spend time with writers, you come away really energized and inspired to get back to your own writing. So my advice would be, you know, go to book launches, go to writing festivals or conferences, and, you know, just introduce yourself to people. If you can join a writing group, you know, that's always great. Or take a class, just anything that gets you in the company of other writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. You mentioned also being an avid reader. So who are a few of your favorite authors and genres?
Well, having lived abroad for so long, I am really drawn to stories about people navigating two or more cultures. So I don't actually know if there is a name for that genre. I guess it's like international literary fiction or something like that.
Probably is. I think there's a name for every genre,
Yeah,
even if I'm not aware of it.
Exactly. Or maybe cultural heritage fiction. I think I've seen that on Amazon. So these are novels that are, you know, either they're set in another country or they're about immigrant communities in the U.S. So writers like, you know, Chimamanda Adichie, Aminata Forna, Min Jin Lee, Sabina Murray, Mohsin Hamid, you know, all these international writers. I really love all of them. Imbolo Mbue is another. And then now that I'm living in Bangladesh, I've been reading a lot of Bangladeshi writing, again, to get to know the country. So there's a wonderful trilogy called the Bangladesh, like two different words, trilogy, by Tamima Anam, who is a British Bangladeshi writer. And that's a great way to get to know the country because she really goes through like the entire 50 years of independence that they've had. You know, each novel set in a different time period. The other genre that I have to confess that I just absolutely love is, you know, anything Jane Austen. I mean, I'm just such a sucker for Jane Austen. I love her, and can't get enough, you know, of her. I reread, you know, her books all the time.
I agree. And I read not anything Jane Austen adjacent, but a lot of things that Jane Austen adjacent. To varying levels of, goodness. I mean, you're like,
yes,
like good writing.
Yeah. Yeah. And watch movies too.
Yes.
You know, there's a really fun, I don't know if you've ever seen, there's like a Bollywood movie called
I've seen it so many times.
Bride and Prejudice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That was
No
really
Life
fun.
Without Wife. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to watch it now. You mentioned your website. So if you can share the website and any social media that you are available on.
Sure. So my website is elizabethschick.com. Now it's important you spell Shick right. It's S-H-I-C-K. So not like the razor blade. No relation to the razor blade. And you can find actually like, you know, links to all my social media on the website, but I will also mention, I have a Facebook author page, which is Elizabeth Shick Author, and Instagram, which is Liz Shick Author. And then I have a Substack as well, which is a monthly newsletter I write about books, writing, and life abroad. So that is called Author Abroad, and you can find it on Substack by searching Author Abroad or elizabethschick.substack.com or something like that.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, we've talked about a lot of different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted?
I think the only other thing is to say that I love hearing from readers. So I used to be shy about this myself. I would never write to authors just to say like, whatever, I liked your book or ask a question or whatever. But I now realize that that's what it's all about. We write in order to be read, to share our ideas and kind of start a conversation. And to have a conversation, you need two people. So it's really nice to hear from readers. I also like talking to book clubs. So please get in touch. Again, you can do that on my website. There's like a, contact me page. And I will definitely write back.
I think sometimes we idolize the authors that we love so much, even though, we kind of put them on celebrity status, and most of you all are just normal people.
Just normal people. Yes, exactly.
I've met a lot of normal people through this podcast. Yeah. It's been nice, but, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to me about writing and especially about the Golden Land. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your excellent questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you once again to Elizabeth for taking the time to speak with me about her book, especially since they were in Massachusetts at the time rather than Bangladesh, where they are currently living. So I don't know if they were on vacation, but I really appreciate Elizabeth taking that time to speak to me. If you are a fan of stories that involve places and cultures that maybe you're not quite as familiar with, or even if you are familiar with Myanmar, Burma, however you think of it, it's currently Myanmar, and that culture, then, or if you are a fan of stories with complicated family relationships or family relationships that cross cultures as this one does, then you should definitely check out this book. And not only is it a good, compelling story with characters that you get to know and appreciate and learn about and who have good arcs, but it's also a story that can teach you about a place and a culture that maybe you don't know as much about. I looked up so many different things from the reading of this book. I kept looking up pictures of places that were being described, and I looked up the last king and the queen to find out a little bit more about their history, because we hear a lot about them through the stories that Etta tells, that Etta recounts that her grandmother had told her, etc. So it was a lot of fun for me to learn about a place and a culture that I didn't know as much about before. And when I went to look for the link to the marionettes, the live shows of the marionettes, there's also a lot of books that Elizabeth has on her website that talk about Myanmar, Burma, the history. I'm sure I just glanced through it, but novels, nonfiction, etc. So if you're interested in reading more, you can check those books out on her website. So thank you to Elizabeth. Thank you for joining me. You should definitely check out this book if you or someone you know might be interested in it. I hope you will join me for the next episode. We're going back to crime fiction. Patrick H. Moore will be joining me to talk about his book 27 Days. So join me for that interview on the next episode. And you know what's coming. In the meantime, do all of those lovely things that really help this podcast get out to more people. You can leave a review. You should follow on the podcast platform that you listen to this podcast on, so you always know when there are new episodes. And of course, you can follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Please come find me as the podcast and let me know what you're reading and what you think of the authors and not the authors, but the books. If you've read any of the books of the authors that I have spoken to, love hearing those stories and your thoughts on the books. As I said at the beginning, I hope you have something nice, relaxing, fun, whatever you want planned for this weekend that is coming up. But of course, my main wish for you is what it always is, and that I hope your next weekend or week or month or what have you is filled with plenty of time to get yourself lost in plenty of good books. Thank you so much. Talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.